speak to you on the Voters' Veto, Mr. Eric Butler, the National Director of the Australian League of Rights.
Well, thanks, Mr. Chairman, my fellow Australians. If any of you were listening to the broadcast from Parliament on Wednesday of last week, you must have been quite astonished, because Senator Ron Boswell, who purports to represent the National Party in the Senate from Queensland, spent quite a period reading out what can only be described as a rehash of an old smear concerning the League of Rights. And he was followed by several other senators, and clearly we had another orchestrated attack on the League. The Labor Socialists must have sat back with tremendous pleasure to hear they didn't need to smear the League any longer. They could leave it to those that are supposed to be called Conservatives. As a result of this and some newspaper comments, Channel 9 felt the matter was of such national importance they had to get hold of me at very short notice in Western Australia, and I was some 40 miles in the bush from Perth. I did suggest I thought they'd be wasting a lot of money. We'd been through all this before. However, if they wanted to see me, they'd better make their own arrangements, so they had to send a helicopter for me. And after some difficulty, the helicopter chap found me in the bush, and they got me down there, and Senator Boswell wouldn't appear with me to debate, but he was on the same program. And then they had to get me home again, and that meant another 40 miles in a taxi. So obviously someone thought this was of tremendous importance. Well, perhaps you're asking, well, why haven't I seen the program? Well, the short answer is the reason you haven't seen the program is they didn't get what they expected. Because I was able to tell the good senator a few truths he didn't know about. And in fact, of course, which he had to admit, there was a time not so long ago when he was quite happy to accept the support of the League of Rights. Now you may ask, well, what's the cause of this extraordinary outburst? Well, the answer is, my friends, there's a new mood in Australian politics, and particularly in Queensland we've seen some quite dramatic developments, particularly the by-election in Benambra, Sir Joe Bajelki-Peterson's old electorate, and right across this country now that mood is starting to express itself. And if you believe what the critics of the League are saying, we've not only taken over the National Party, according to Ron Boswell, we've taken over the churches, and now if I accept what's going on in the Liberal Party, where they're all scrambling to get aboard this idea in Western Australia, we've taken over the Liberal Party too, if you believe this. The truth is that an idea that's been promoted for a long time has reached that stage where historically I believe it's about to change Australian politics as they haven't been changed for a long time. That's the reason for it. In other words, as you meet here tonight, I believe we're on the eve of developments which either can swing this country back onto a sane course, or if we fail to do that, then regretfully the future looks extremely bleak. I don't believe it is bleak. I've never been so optimistic as I am tonight, and to see this well-attended meeting is a manifestation of that interest which I find right across Australia at the present time. I think it will assist us, Mr. Chairman, before we really get down to this constitutional concept, if we establish a background picture. What are we talking about? Why are we concerned? I'd start by saying you've no longer any need to convince a conservative estimate 80%. I'd say 80% of Australians now have got a deep gut feeling that something's gone wrong. You don't need to convince them of that. They don't perhaps know what has gone wrong or why it's gone wrong, but they're convinced something is wrong. There's no argument about that. And as I said in that television interview to the good senator and his friends, you've got to face the fact the overwhelming majority of the Australian electors today no longer trust the major political parties. They don't trust politicians. In fact, they've got contempt for much of what has been put forward over recent years. And so we don't need to convince people of that, but what they're looking for are some answers. That frustration has got to find itself in constructive action. And that is why this idea, I believe, as time has come. I think we'd better go back a little and first of all look at some aspects of our situation. Our chairman's just touched on a few of them. It's almost mind-blowing when you think that as we meet here tonight, the politicians elected by the Australian people are engaged through international conventions in handing this country over. We saw, of course, the first manifestation of this back in the early 80s in a case called the Kawada case, when the Queensland government took the then Fraser government to the High Court and argued, you can't interfere in our affairs concerning Aboriginal affairs. That's unconstitutional. And they took the federal government before the High Court. And the High Court gave a ruling which in essence signalled the end of free Australia unless we can reverse what's taking place. That High Court, by a majority decision 4-3, ruled that because Australia had signed a particular international convention, that gave the federal government almost unlimited power inside Australia. It's true that not a great number saw the significance at that time. But then a little later, 1983, we had the federal elections, and you may recall that during that election campaign, Mr. Bob Hawke, leader of the Labor Party, threatened the people of Tasmania and their government. If he were elected to office, he was going to stop them from building a dam on the Franklin River. Now, I'm not here tonight to argue whether a dam should be built on the Franklin River or not. But what I'm here tonight to say is that Section 100 of the Constitution says in black and white that the states have got the rights and the power to do exactly that. But Mr. Hawke said, you elect me and I'm going to stop you. He proceeded to do exactly that. The Tasmanian government took the Hawke government before the High Court, and again the High Court ruled with a majority of decision of 4-3 because we'd signed another international convention. In this case, we'd put part of Australia, southwest Tasmania, under something called the World Heritage Commission, closely linked with that division of the United Nations known as the United Nations Education Cultural Organisation. Mr. Gough Whitlam represented us, or he was there as the Australian representative for a period, a Marxist-dominated organisation. But because we'd signed that convention, then the federal government could do what it liked concerning rivers and waterways in Australia, irrespective of what the written constitution said. As you meet here tonight, your fellow Australians in North Queensland are in a state of deepening shock. It doesn't matter whether you're a farmer up there or running a businessman or who you are, you don't know what your future's going to be, because now Mr. Hawke says he's going to put a tremendous area, 200 miles running north of Townsville, also under the World Heritage Commission. And when he's done that, he knows then he'll have the constitutional power to do what he likes to that part of Australia and tell the people there what they can do and what they can't do. You may have missed in last week's Australian a list in very fine print, about 6-point, a list, I think, from memory of over 100 potential areas in Australia for listing to be put under the World Heritage Commission. In Western Australia, the first area, already the controversies start, a little place called Shark Bay, north of Geraldton. Whole areas concerning wildflowers. The whole Murray River Basin. All of these areas are being suggested. Kakadu Park. And in essence, what Mr Hawke and those behind Mr Hawke are saying is we can now give the whole of Australia away, and we, the Australian people, can't do one thing to stop it. It's quite constitutional if we accept this situation. We've got to understand how this incredible situation arose. And that's why I think we've got to go back and spend a few minutes. First of all, I'd suggest a little history. This, of course, is our Bicentenary Year. This is the year we're supposed to be celebrating 200 years of the development of European civilization in Australia. You must have noticed, of course, that we've got all the knockers all telling us what an awful record we've got. Well, I want to tell you here tonight, the record, as far as the truth is concerned, is an exceptionally good one. And our forebears did a tremendous job in transplanting from Europe a particular type of civilization, which I want to talk about, the Bicentenary. There was no better way to start the Bicentenary than the birthday parties, it was called, in Sydney. And I thought it was a tremendous event. The spirit was enormous. It did demonstrate that the Australian people are still capable of getting together and enjoying themselves. And of course, the keynote, in my opinion, was the address by Prince Charles. Now, of course, not many people have heard about it because the media didn't bother to publish it. I don't object to them spending a lot of space describing Princess Diana's clothing. I think she's quite nice. But I think they might have given Prince Charles a little space, because in his message, which I can assure you Mr Hawke didn't look too happy about, he said what we should be really celebrating this year is our Constitution. Now, how can we celebrate our Constitution if we don't understand the Constitution? A Gallup poll taken not so long ago, from memory, showed that at least 50% of Australians under 40 years of age don't even know they've got a Constitution, still less what it's all about. And I think you'll agree that says something for our mangled educational system. When young Australians are growing up without any understanding of their tremendous heritage, they've been cut off from their roots. And as they don't know where they've come from, it's not surprising that large numbers don't know where they're going. And there's a tremendous breakdown. Our society's breaking down, more so in the big cities. As witnessed, if you will recall, during the last 2 New Year Eves in Melbourne, our second biggest city, we couldn't run the public transport system after 7 o'clock at night. Why? Because those running it said it was too dangerous to run it, and if they couldn't have armed guards or the police, they weren't going to run it. Now, I think that tells you something. Law and order is broken down. Violence is everywhere. And all back because we no longer understand. And that is why the League of Rights over the many, many years has tried to warn people about what was happening in the field of education. So what is this Constitution? That Constitution, my friends, is the formal expression of a heritage that goes back not merely 200 years, not merely back 500 years or 1,000 years, it goes back 2,000 years. And it's that heritage which we've got to understand if we're going to defend ourselves. And we're the heirs to it. That's the real issue. That heritage concerns the question of government. Now, in human affairs, although it's not very popular to say this these days, there are absolutes. There are absolutes, there's right and wrong, and there's absolutes in so many other areas. The famous Lord Acton gave us one when he said that all power tends to corrupt, absolute power corrupts absolutely. That is as absolute as the law of gravity. And irrespective of what you think about the law of gravity, And we've got some of our smart academics that might even suggest it doesn't exist, and on the blackboard they can prove that. Well, I don't care what they can prove. I'll guarantee as an ordinary, simple soul that every time they jump over the cliff they'll get exactly the same result. And they'll demonstrate not only, as it's been well put, that they're violating that absolute, they're demonstrating the truth of the law. If we can't get back to absolutes, my friends, there's no future. There's an absolute concerning government. That was enunciated by the contemporary of Acton, Lord Bryce. And Bryce said it's the natural tendency of all government to increase its own power. And ever since men have been governing themselves, they've been grappling with that problem. How do you have government? Because we're social beings, we must live together without government taking more and more power until government becomes a tyrant. How do we deal with that? Well, you can go right back to the Greek philosophers, to Plato and Socrates and Aristotle. You can look at the contribution of the Greeks, and they discovered some truths about what is known as democracy. The word democracy, of course, comes from the Greek. Demos, the people, the will of the people. Obviously, there's not much democracy about today because the will of the electors doesn't prevail in many areas at all. In fact, it's hard to find any area where the will of the electors prevails. The Greeks discovered these three truths. Number one, representative governments requires, first of all, that the people to be represented must be basically the same kind of people. Homogeneous, that's number one. Number two, they must all share the same value system, whether you call it a religion or a philosophy. That's number two. And number three, the government must be close enough to the people so that physically the people can control it. And so, of course, the Greeks gave us the famous city-states, where a degree of democracy did work. In other words, genuine self-government cannot be divorced from local government, decentralised government. And I never cease to be amazed that quite well-meaning people in one breath will tell you their local council is raiding them off their properties and they're a pack of this and that. And the next breath was likely to say this, but if only we had a world government, that would solve all our problems. Let me tell you this, if you could, which you can't of course, create a world government, it would be the ultimate in tyranny, such the world has never seen. There are absolutes. And of course the Romans made their contribution. The idea of checks and balances, upper houses, lower houses. But from an historical point of view, and that's the aspect I'm speaking from tonight, this whole question was not resolved until the coming of Christianity. Now, as I've often said, at this point you can all rest easy. I'm not going to give you a sermon. I'm not a very preachy type. But what I am saying cannot be denied by even my agnostic or atheistic friends, because they would be disputing the history of ideas. You see, Christianity brought a new and absolutely explosive idea into human affairs, one that had never been heard of before, not to any extent, and that idea was that every individual was of value. The individual was of value for himself, not because he was statistic, not because he was there to be controlled, but for himself. Every individual was of value. And of course, from a Christian point of view, it's put that that's obvious in the sense that we believe that man was created in the image of God, so therefore we partake of that divine attribute. Everyone counted. Even the prostitutes counted. Now that was absolutely explosive, that idea. And the logical extension of that was, of course, that if every individual's of value, individuals are born to be free, to know the Father, can be in contact with the Father, well then it's quite logical that man's human institutions exist to serve that valuable individual. And so the famous rejoinder, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And how did Christ's opponents react to that? Crucify him. That truth was too much. You see, the Pharisees had created a type of society of legalism in which you didn't trust the individual only exists to be controlled. And there was a mass of regulations and decrees all written down. No individual could be trusted. And so this idea shattered that completely. Well, then, of course, the next question that arose from a philosophical point of view, and I'm looking at it from that point now, if individuals were born to be free, every individual got contact with the Father, well, then how do you regulate associations between human beings? If we don't use force and compulsion and regulation, how do we regulate? Well, my friends, we were given another really great truth. And that truth was that we should love one another. You should love your neighbour as yourself. Because if you accepted this revelation and you were in contact with God, then you should respect your neighbour also. Because he also was of value. And my friends, if you'll think about that, any society that operates on that law, which partakes of truth, is one of harmony. And it's worthwhile thinking about when we see what's happening today, that up until relatively recently, that law to a great extent did permeate our society and our culture. An old gentleman last week at Kalgoorlie, out on the mines there, recalling a better time when there was something called Australian mateship, when you could leave your goods and things around, you didn't need to lock anything up because you did trust one another, you respected one another. He recalled a time where you did business on a different basis from that today, where a man's handshake was sufficient, a man's word was his bond, because we did respect one another. We're all of value. But we've so degenerated, my friends, that we're even advised now, don't even get married today unless you've signed a contract. Don't trust anybody, not even the person you're going to marry. That's the state we've reached, because that tremendous law of loving one another has been undermined. Then, of course, there was the famous answer, that pretty tricky question about the Roman coin. And Christ, of course, gave the answer. Yes, render unto Caesar, that is government, that which belongs to government. But you don't render so much unto government, there's nothing left to render unto God. And in the famous words of Lord Acton, that one statement, Christ resolved the problem that baffled all the philosophers. Because now he gave government a status it never had before, but also gave it a limit it never had before. And also insisted that government existed to serve the individual. And government itself must be under a higher law. It can't operate in a moral vacuum. Now, my friends, these ideas I've so briefly and inadequately outlined to you, these are the ideas which over the next 2,000 years gave us the greatest civilization that man's ever seen. Gave the individual a value unknown at that time. You see, all the great Eastern religions are all religions of pessimism. They're religions of pessimism. Christianity is a religion of hope, creativeness. And so Western man, in his literature, in his politics, through the whole of his society, expressed those ideas. Oh yes, there are imperfections. There's no need to dwell on the black parts, but let's look at the broad picture. And beyond doubt, those ideas found their highest expression in that little country once called England. And in that country, they, over centuries, wove right into the fabric of social life these Christian ideas, particularly in the field of what I want to say a few words about, because it absolutely is essential as we come to face the battle we're in, something called English common law. English common law was a tremendous advance on the old Roman law. That was an advance too, because English common law started from the Christian viewpoint that every individual was of value, every one. And every individual was assumed to be innocent until he was proved guilty. Now that was quite something. English common law developed organically. It affected the social structure, the political structure. And the English people had rights as a result of that Christian heritage which no other people had developed to that stage. We then come, of course, to that famous incident, which is in the news a little. No wonder how many people understand its significance. Saw it on television the other night. A copy of Magna Carta has been brought out for expo. And I wonder how many looking at the Latin there will understand what's the story all about. Well, it's not much good asking the kids today, because you might get some sort of an answer like a smart New Zealand kid put to me that he hadn't heard of what race that horse had run in last. That's all he knew about Magna Carta. Magna Carta is one of the great signposts. There's nothing new in Magna Carta. It was a restatement of these basic truths and principles which we are grappling to defend today. The Caesar of the day, King John, had taken so much power, excessive taxes, much else, that his subjects had little or nothing left to render unto God. Now, at that famous confrontation, the most important group there were the great church leaders of the day, headed by Archbishop Stephen Langton. And let me hasten to say, Mr. Chairman, they are a completely different breed to some of the pink clergy we got masquerading as Christians in the pulpits today. These were men of great courage, men who spoke with authority and said to Caesar, now listen, we don't want to destroy you. We need government. That's part of God's plan for society. But we've had too much of you. And what we're going to do is to restate some fundamental principles. And Magna Carta simply restates what had been evolved over centuries. The right of every individual to live because he was an individual, because he was a creature of God. The right to own property. And then, of course, they said to Caesar there must be a limit to the amount of taxation you can impose. Because if you can't limit the power of Caesar over taxes, well then, of course, he can become a monster. And it's rather remarkable they thought about 10% would be enough for Caesar. Now, how would you like a limit of 10% taxation today? At a time when Caesar's taking over 50%, and if you don't stop him, he'll take the lot. Everyone counted. Oh, I know at this stage some of my cynical friends say, well, what's all this got to do with me? Why should I be interested in all this? Until, of course, he gets arrested, if he does get arrested, and he's taken off to jail. And after he's been left there for a day, his lawyer does something very important. His lawyer takes the appropriate action under something called Habeas Corpus and says, my client must be produced, he must be brought before a court, he must be charged with some crime, he must be able to defend himself. Where did that idea come from? That's in Magna Carta. Also the idea that we're all entitled to a trial by our fellows, 12 men, and much else. Even the man convicted could not be deprived of his tools of trade because you deprive him the right to live. This is Magna Carta, the foundation of so much that we've forgotten about today. And I want to point out that the great churchman ordered that the charter be hung in all the churches and read to the populace so that all understand these rights all derived from their Christian heritage. And over the centuries those ideas reached that stage in what today we call Britain, where they had a political system, a social system and a law system, all based upon the principle of protecting the individual. That was the whole concept. Local government, close to the people. English common law. The national government, a Trinitarian government, division of power. House of Commons. The upper house, not only Lord's temporal, but Lord's spiritual. And then the crown itself. And the crown itself is witnessed by the coronation service, pledges himself or herself to Almighty God to uphold these God-given rights. And there you've got, beyond doubt, the nearest we've ever had to a Christian concept of a society and Christian government. And it was the envy of the world. You can read the great French, the German philosophers and many others all wrote about it. This was looked up to. This was a tremendous achievement. Well, my friends, we're celebrating the Bicentenary. I just want to stress this point, that 200 years ago when Captain Arthur Phillips with his 11 ships pulled into Botany Bay, he didn't find the common law all lying around on the beach. He didn't find all this heritage all there. It all had to be brought with them. And while our beginnings weren't very auspicious, I suppose, nevertheless, that's what they brought. And slowly but surely over the next 200 years, that heritage was taken from a particular part of Europe, and other Europeans, as some of you here tonight know, joined and came here because they saw the tremendous advantages of that type of society. People flocked from all over the world to be under the Union Jack, later in, of course, the Australian flag, because of what that flag stood for, a Christian heritage. Well, it needs to be said at a time when you get the impression, if you listen to our federal politicians, that all wisdom comes out of Canberra, that all the basic foundations of Australia are all laid at a time when I don't think Canberra is even a sheep paddock. Look around your capital cities. Look at your history. Look at the great achievements of your forebears under great difficulties. Only the week before last out there in the eastern goldfields, I was looking there at what the early miners did with very primitive technology compared with what we've got today. Look at what our pioneering farmers did. Look at the tremendous buildings in the capital cities, the harbours, the railway. All of this was established long before Federation, with 6, you might say, mini nations, but all modelled on the one original model. English common law, the rights of the individual, local government, all established. Yes, your state governments also, Trinitarian, a lower house, an upper house, and the Crown, all there. This was all established over 200 years by our forebears. Well, then we come to that next point of development that's so important, when, of course, naturally, it was felt, well, we've got 6 mini nations living in the one island continent. Perhaps it would be of advantage if we had one federal government to look after those matters common to all of us. And so the great discussions of last century took place. Regretfully, they're not taught in the schools today. How many can tell you about a chap called Parkes or Barton or any of these other men? But as you read through those debates and discussions, the thing that strikes you, that these men were absolute giants compared with these little political pygmies we got strutting about the stage today. They knew their history. They had their values right. And so running through all their discussions was, how are we going to have this federal system without that natural law of all governments taking more power, and the federal government could become a monster. That was their great concern. And they went all over the world looking at constitutions. They went back to Britain, of course. They went to the United States and looked at their federal system. They went to Canada, looked at the system of confederation, and my friends, they went to a little country called Switzerland, where they've got a constitutional concept which is rather unique. It's operated for 90 years. And at this stage, I'll merely say, as they looked at the Swiss system, they thought it had certain value, but we don't need it. Because, you see, we've got a system under which the individual's going to be protected, a system under which the individual's going to have a real say. And so that federal constitution embodied the wisdom and the knowledge of 2,000 years. The constitution itself starts by stating the source of authority, relying on the blessing of Almighty God. That's the source, the absolute. And then right down to all the other aspects. The small states, South Australia, West Australia, Tasmania, the people there weren't going to vote for this new federation if they were going to be swamped by Sydney and Melbourne. So we had the establishment of a Senate, an upper house, a check, a balance, a state's house, in which all the states were represented irrespective of their size. A tremendous concept. And might I just point out to you, one of the most powerful upper houses in the world that saved us time and time again from worse disasters than those we've already suffered. And then, of course, the Governor-General representing the Crown. And in it we got the right to petition the Crown. But perhaps the most important provision was nothing could be changed concerning the use of power without consulting the people. We had to come back to the people by referendum. And so our forebears thought they had done as good a job as you could do, and there's no doubt they did give us a tremendous document, a tremendous concept. But their worst fears, or some of their fears, were soon justified, as all federal governments started to nibble just a little more power, because a little more power here, a little more power there. And the only way they could get it was to go to the people. But every time they went to the people said no. The people's instincts were sound. And that was the position right up until the Second World War. The overwhelming majority of the referenda were all rejected by the Australian people, keeping power decentralised. Well, then the war brought a new situation. And during the war we had a remarkable Attorney General by the name of Dr. Herbert V. Evatt. Now, Dr. Evatt belonged to that movement called the Fabian Socialist movement. And all I want to say tonight is, unless you've got some understanding of the special subversive role of that movement, you won't understand why we're here tonight and what's happening to your country. The Fabian movement was designed not, as was the Bolshevik movement, to overthrow established government by force, but to permeate government and to take over government from inside and eventually to operate quite legally. And even claim they had a mandate, as we're going to see, for the people to do it. Diabolically clever, the Fabian movement. Dr. Evatt was a spokesman for it, a close friend of Dr. Harold Lasky, the notorious member of the London School of Economics, and much others. Evatt tried to stampede the Australian people. He failed. He was forced to go to the referendum of 1944 in the middle of the war. And once again the Australian people, in spite of the war conditions, said no. And may I just say in passing, there was only one group of Australians that voted yes. Only one, and that was my group, the servicemen. I didn't, of course, but I'm speaking generally. Why did the servicemen vote favour the referendum? Well, those of you who are serving know we all relied for our information in the main on something called army education. Journals like Salt and all the rest. And who ran army education? Well, it was a brilliant young officer by the name of Dr. Jim Cairns and many others. So the whole of that education system was a Fabian system, and so the servicemen didn't know any better. It demonstrates if you control propaganda almost completely, you can get people to vote for their own destruction. Well, the people as a whole said no, though. And Dr. Evatt and his friends then started to evolve something that brings us closer to where we are tonight. And they started to develop this idea, look, we've got to find some way of getting past a constitution which says the people must have a say. And they looked at the Constitution, and they looked at section 51, subsection 29, which says, and obviously that was proper, that a federal government should deal with external affairs. That was one of the major purposes of having a federal government. But the framers never thought that it would be used for the purpose I'm going to outline. They saw it merely as a way in which a federal government would regulate its relationships to other governments, that time mainly British governments, the other parts of the British Empire. But, said Dr. Evatt and his Fabian friends, now if we can use that, we can enter into specific international agreements. In fact, we can now sign conventions with that new Holy of Holies coming into existence called the United Nations, and then we will argue, as we have signed an international agreement, quite legally, quite constitutionally, then we've got the right to legislate to give effect to that agreement inside Australia, over the top of the Constitution. Now, I recall as a young ex-serviceman lecturing my fellow Australians about this threat, and I've got to tell you that I didn't get much response. In fact, some of them suggested to me quite, I thought rather unfairly, that I'd been up in the tropics too long and was suffering from something called the tropo disease, and perhaps I'd get over it in time. The idea we'd ever reach the stage where we wouldn't have a say, that was too ridiculous, too absurd, wasn't it? Well, my friends, the time came when that's exactly where we are. Because the years went on, more and more conventions signed, until eventually that fateful day we produced a High Court which ruled exactly as Dr. Everett anticipated, 4-3. And one of the majority, most dominant of the majority, the man called Lionel Murphy. Now, there's an old Latin tag to the effect that you shouldn't speak evil of the dead. Well, I won't speak evil of the dead, I'll merely say what Shakespeare said, that the evil that men do lives after them. And in this case it certainly has. This man was a Fabian from way back, a secular humanist. He's the man that left you with the family law bill and much else. And he was the dominant member amongst that majority. And in his ruling in the famous Kawada case, he said something we should remember. He said it's absolutely essential that a federal government has this power, because if it couldn't use the external powers as sought, this would cripple Australia from entering into the emerging New World Order. That's one of the most revealing statements you can read. And anyone that's been following the League understands the significance. Those that have got the League background understand a lot more than their fellows. And so, for example, here's an interesting article that appeared in the West Australian the week before last. I pointed this out to people in the West. No one had bothered to look at it. You see, we got visiting this country, or we did. I think he's moved on now somewhere else. The president of the communist state of Romania. And this is a great blurb all about him. He looks very nice there, and his wife. I think they're rather youngish photos, but still there you are. And we read about it. The day before he arrived, the West Australian gave us a classic of the double standards of the big media, where they said, well, we've got to admit that the human rights record of Romania is not very good. There's large number of Christians in jail. There's persecution. But in the interests of trade and commerce, we must be prepared to look perhaps a little more tolerantly on these matters. Please note, we don't take that view towards South Africa, do we? That is different. So this Romanian communist leader arrives, and he's a most interesting character amongst other things that he does. He's built up his own country, but he's a brilliant advocate of the struggle for development in the world and the establishment of a new international economic order. That's what he's here about. So there's Senator Murphy telling you we've got to breach the Constitution so we can fit Australia into the new world order. One of the minority judges, however, said something much more important on the other side. And if I had my way, Mr. Chairman, I'd have Mr. Justice Wilson's words in red letters on every wall right throughout Australia so we could look at them. Every day. In the morning and perhaps at lunchtime and then before we went to bed at night. Because this is what he said. Listen to it carefully. It is no exaggeration to say that what is emerging is a sophisticated network of international arrangements directed to the personal, economic, social and cultural development of all human beings. That's rather a far-reaching statement from a learned judge. He went on. The effect of investing the Parliament with power through Section 51, subsection 29, in all these areas would be to transfer to the Commonwealth of virtually unlimited power. Unlimited power in almost every conceivable aspect of life in Australia, including health and hospitals, the workplace, law and order, education and recreation and cultural activity, to mention but a few general heads. In other words, the way has been cleared to establish the complete totalitarian state in Australia, quite legally and constitutionally, without the Australian people being consulted. And that's exactly what is now taking place with this whole program of conventions. More and more areas put under the World Heritage Commission. And please, ladies and gentlemen, don't immediately respond and say, well, we must get rid of this awful hawk government immediately to stop this, because what is called the opposition subscribes to this total program. Mr. John Howard subscribes to it. No objection in principle to North Queensland being put under the World Heritage Commission. His only difference, a few degrees. That great fighting organisation that you farmers thought was going to save the family farm, the National Farmers Federation, it doesn't disagree. It merely says they want better compensation, which in essence is they only want better surrender terms, that's all. The opposition subscribes to the new international economic order. I know you'll find politicians from time to time, Senator Boswell suggesting this is a hairy idea dreamt up by the League of Rights. Apparently he's not aware that as far back as 1974 the United Nations formally agreed to the establishment of the new international economic order, and every government there, the communists and all the lot, voted for it, and the Australian representative put his hand up. We are committed to it, formally committed to it. The new international economic order. If you're listening to the senator that speaks at the present time on primary industry, secondary industries, he tells you, and the N word now, you've heard it time and time again, is restructuring. That's the new buzzword. Restructuring. We've got to restructure, says Senator Button, primary industry. Well, how do we restructure primary industry? Well, we restructure it by getting rid of a lot more farmers. And how do we get rid of them? We use the debt system to persuade them, well, the best way is to swap what equity you got in your property left to a trust of some kind. They might even let you stay on your property till you're dead, and then you're finished. All over the world, that program under the debt system is emerging. I see it everywhere, New Zealand, United States, 1,000 farmers going off their farms every week. Up in Canada there, I see a big ad in the Globe and Mail by elders, in essence saying to farmers, well, why suffer ulcers anymore? Here's a way out. All you've got to do, hand over the equity, we'll cancel the debt out. You can stay there till you die, but we'll take the place. That's what we call restructuring. Part of the total program's the CER, closer economic relations with New Zealand. So we've got to phase out some of our primary industries. Number one, the dairy industry. Take it to its logical conclusion. I suppose Mr. Chairman will be scanning the skies every morning to see if the milk plane from New Zealand's going to make it. Otherwise we won't have milk for breakfast. It's all there. And why have we got the CER? Because we've got to unite Australia and New Zealand to fit them into something called the Pacific Common Market. In the same way the British have surrendered to the European Common Market. And I say surrender. When I was in Britain late last year, I was interested in the fact that at last year's Conservative conference, the annual conference, there was a number of resolutions concerning law and order. You see, the British have got a few problems with something called the multiracial society. They've discovered it doesn't work, and there's a lot of violent crime. And so, many resolutions that the Conservative Party should tighten up on law and order and should even consider going back to capital punishment in the case of the worst murders. But they were informed by the Minister, the British government virtually has lost control of law and order. That's now under a government in Brussels because they've signed something called the European Act. And that's the way you go, my friends. But you see, we've been fortunate up until now because that constitution has protected you. But now it's been shattered by this devious technique. And it's no good looking at the opposition because they subscribe to this. Well, that's where we are. And you can go on and on. So the real question we're now asking is, well, what can we do in the face of this? What can we as individuals do? Can we do anything? Well, we've really, I think, got to go back to our basic principles. We've got to go back to our roots. And we've got to understand why we evolved the system of government we had, what were its essential features, and can we restore them? Can we regenerate them? Now, what is called the Westminster System was an excellent system in the sense that before the parties got so controlled as they are today, there was a degree of independence amongst the members of Parliament. Occasionally they'd even cross the floor and vote against their own party. There was a type of free deliberative assembly. But my friends, that's all gone. Big money now controls parties. The individual member is virtually a bought man. All he's got to do is to get his snout into that trough and keep it there for just 2 terms, and he's got it made. He gets his superannuation, all the perks, all geared to the inflation rate. So there's a great tendency not to rock the boat. Then, of course, we got the dilution of the value of the individual vote, the manipulation of the vote. And so we've got to admit, my friends, as the starting point for salvation, that the Westminster system has broken down. And particularly as now the Fabians have shattered your constitution and they don't even need to consult you on major issues. They, in fact, can create a totalitarian state through international agreements, and they don't even need to talk to you about it. That's our question. Well, as I said earlier, our pioneer forebears did look at the Swiss system, but said, well, it's a great idea, but we don't need it. But my friends, we do need it because it is essential if we're going to get a say again. Now, the Swiss system is very simple. It suits the Swiss. They've had it for 90 years. Even under orthodox financial arrangements, Switzerland, anybody that's been there knows this is one of the most orderly, stable societies in Europe. They've got a low taxation rate. The reason that is, of course, their politicians seem to have a very different approach to the ones we've got here, in the sense they seem to regard it as an honour to serve your fellows. So they don't get paid very much. Isn't that a novel idea? And then, of course, they've got a low-cost government, so they've got a low inflation rate. You know, you can't even become a citizen of Switzerland from outside unless you're accepted by the people in the local area called the canton where you live. How different from our situation, where even John Howard said that immigration is not a fit subject for the Australian people to vote on. That's a matter for executive order. You know, Big Brother knows best. The Swiss then have got a system under which the government gets about its business, but the electors have got the right on any issue they feel strongly enough about to petition for a referendum, and if, in the case of most federal issues, 4% petition, they are constitutionally obliged to hold a referendum, and the result of that referendum is constitutionally binding on the government. So it's not so long ago the Swiss government decided perhaps it was time for little Switzerland to join the United Nations. Now, many people stagger to know they haven't joined that Holy of Holies, and people ask, well, how have they got on? They seem to have got on very well. It means, for example, they don't contribute to a lot of the destructive programs we contribute to. But the federal Swiss government felt the time had come, so they started to legislate. Just a minute, said the Swiss people. We'd like a say on that. They petitioned. They very easily on this got their 4%. The referendum was held, and nearly 70% said no, we don't want to join the United Nations. And that ended that. How would you like that right, to say no occasionally? Wouldn't it be marvellous? Excessive taxes, retrospective taxes, immigration, all of these issues. The Swiss, if they're so interested enough, can have a say. And people say, goodness me, they must be voting all the time in Switzerland. No, they don't very often vote there, because the politicians are always conscious of the fact they can't be too extreme in anything they do, because the electors can always reach out and say, hey, just a minute, we'd like a say about that. In other words, you've got a different situation altogether. We used to have that once, basically, but it's gone. That's what we've got to get back. Well, can we get it back? My friends, we're on the way to getting it back. There's a movement that's already taking off. Now, it's true, of course, as the chairman said, the League of Rights has been talking about this for years. The idea of electoral control, electors' association. We've experimented with many ideas, we've encouraged people, and I'd have to be honest and say that over the long years you wondered ever we would reach the stage where what you were sowing was going to take root and grow. But, my friends, events have forced us to a position where we can now take heart. A valuable contribution made by one of our true academics. Now, we should be grateful, my friends, at a time when I know what's called academia has been poisoned, really poisoned with the anti-British, anti-Christian ideas, but here and there, like real gold, you see glittering. Men that are still holding the line. Men like, for example, Professor Geoffrey Blaney on immigration. In spite of all the attacks, he stands up and says it so well. A true Australian. But here's another man, Professor Geoffrey Walker, Professor of Law at Queensland University. And he provided the best study yet on the whole subject of what he called the initiative and referendum or the people's law, outlining the history of this idea, outlining the breakdown in our system, answering all the objections, pointing out that what is proposed is merely a development of our own tradition and heritage, regenerated to meet a new situation. And others are taking it up. And slowly but surely, across Australia, this idea has grown, almost as if its time has come. Let's look at what has been happening. In hindsight, I would say that the last federal elections were a type of watershed. Let's just have a look at the background. You'll recall, of course, that before those elections, the electoral stocks of the Hawke government seemed to be rather low. And Mr Hawke kept telling us he wasn't going to have an early election, and then, of course, had one, which demonstrates how truthful political leaders can be. And what was his reason for that early election? Well, he went to the Governor-General and in essence said, well, Your Excellency, here's a major piece of legislation. It's part of our total strategy, financial strategy, called the ID card. The Senate's rejected it twice. And Your Excellency, we desperately need that ID card in place, because how are we going to stop all these tax cheats? Of course, none of them here tonight, I know that, Mr Chairman. Everybody here, I know, pays as much tax as you can because you all love doing it. And therefore, Your Excellency, we'll have to have an early election to get it endorsed by the people. So he had his early double dissolution, and an amazing thing took place. We had an election campaign in which the very issue that was used to trigger it was hardly mentioned. Mr Hawke didn't mention it. Mr Howard didn't mention it. He told a friend of mine he wasn't going to campaign on it. He didn't think there were any votes in that. How little he understood. So eventually, as you will recall, Mr Hawke managed to get back. We won't go into that except to say that mainly because there's no opposition. And immediately he made a startling announcement. His arrogance came out, and he now said, ladies and gentlemen of Australia, you're going to have this ID card whether you like it or not. I've got an overwhelming mandate. That's what he said. Well, when Mr Hawke said that, he made a major mistake. He touched something in the Australian psyche. The information about the ID card that had been spread by the League and other movements was now starting to be understood. And even you had staunch Labor voters saying, but I didn't vote for the ID card and I don't want it. In fact, it's damn dangerous. And a grassroots movement took off and swept this country. It was a manifestation of that deep frustration that had been building up for so long, and all the educational work. Most remarkable. You had meetings where people who called themselves left-wing were on the same platform with people calling themselves right-wing. And they demonstrated that much of the political difference we have are quite artificial, that when you really get down to the nitty-gritty, no individual wants to be the victim of Big Brother in this or any other form. And they said, we don't want that. And eventually that movement reached the stage where Mr Hawke had to back away. That doesn't mean he's given up, because they're going to try and bring it in by the back door, as we could have a look at later if you like. But nevertheless, it did something, that campaign, to the Australian people. it did touch something in them. And they said, we're not going to be pushed around. And they started to sense danger. And then beyond doubt, the next issue, which particularly here in Victoria and New South Wales, produced something I haven't seen for about 40 years, the proposed gun control legislation. And you could write a whole book on that, the phenomena of the reaction of people. The tremendous march in Melbourne, 55,000 people, and these weren't the type of people, the weirdy-beardy types you were associated with marching. This was the authentic face of real Australia. Concerned citizens. They weren't going to be pushed around, and there was deep suspicion, particularly amongst our ethnic friends that had seen all this in Europe, and they said, my God, it's coming here. It was a phenomenon, I have to agree. Up in New South Wales, in fact, we reached the stage, as some of you will remember, you couldn't get halls big enough to take the meetings, they had to have them in football grounds. And there was one meeting I went to up in New South Wales, and the dear old soul there, she must have been over 80, and she was really stirred up, and I said, well, why are you here, madam? What's the point? Well, she remembered her late husband had a gun, was in the cupboard somewhere. I'm quite sure she wouldn't know the front end from the back end, still less fire it, but nevertheless it was there, it was in her subconscious, it belonged to her, it gave her some feeling, and she said, Mr. Butler, they're going to come and take it. Not, she said, over my dead body. My God, I've never seen anything like it. And you had that right throughout New South Wales and Victoria. And you all know that even our Fabian Premier, Mr. Hawke, Mr. Keynes, put his hands up and says, well, he's had enough. You know, even Jeff Kennett, our wobbly Liberal leader, he's got off the fence. He's found, that's a very dangerous place to be on the fence. You can do yourself a lot of damage there. And he's got off the fence. And the Australian people are starting to realise we're not going to stand all this. And they went on from there, and then we started to have some elections. We started in Adelaide. The first by-election, Mr. Chris Herbert, the former Minister of Education, he probably had come to the conclusion it was time to leave the sinking ship, and off he went. Well, into that campaign, a group of just ordinary Australians got themselves together and called themselves the Groundswell Movement. And they promoted this idea of the elector's veto, and they went to all the candidates and they put literature out. And people have never heard this before, and I thought it's a marvellous idea. This is really tremendous. And you all know what happened. Mr. Hawke got the shock of his life. Even old-time Labor voters deserting him in droves. And someone pointed out, and that used to be in the Labor Party policy once, but was taken out by a chap called Don Dunstan, Fabian Socialist. And they went on from there, and then we moved to New South Wales. Now, you haven't heard the full story, the media hasn't told you, the most remarkable aspect of the New South Wales election, where you now had nearly as many electors voting for independents as voted for the National Party. They elected 7 independents to the Parliament. 5 of them had signed the pledge to support that elector's veto. You had swings against the Labor Party up to 25% in places like Newcastle. Unheard of. And new types of Australians coming forward, the local mayor, traditional Australian. Independents have the balance of power in the upper house, and already Mr. Greiner's a little bit urgy about this too, and getting a bit irritated about that. A new development in Australian politics. And that shook Mr. Hawke and shook all the parties pretty rigid. But there was worse to come. And they moved up then to Queensland. We had the by-election in Broome. And that awful character called Joe Bajelki-Peterson came out of the shadows again and continued to haunt them. And he said, I can no longer support the candidate called National because that's not the party that it used to be once. I'm going to urge you all to vote for this chap called Taylor. And sure enough, Taylor, the Liberal, got elected over the National Party candidate in the blue ribbon National Party seat. Then we went back to Adelaide. And in Adelaide, this Groundswell movement then tried a new tactic in Port Adelaide. And this time, they simply approached every elector going into the polling there on this issue, and then they gave them a little sticker which says, very simply, I support the elector's veto, I'd like a say. And urge them, if you agree with that, irrespective of who you vote for, put that on your ballot paper. Self-help, resourceful Australians. Then they got themselves inside the ballot, so they could do some scrutineering. and carefully monitor what happened. My friends, 32% of the electors in Port Adelaide put that sticker on their ballot paper and said, we like that idea, we want to say. And all the party representatives were almost going white. This was a new phenomenon in Australian politics. But the last straw, of course, was up in Benandra, the by-election there, where you had 4 candidates in Sir Joe Bajelki-Peterson's old electorate, where incidentally the National Party vote has always been under Sir Joe, the primary vote between 75 and 80%. So they had the official National Party candidate, backed by Sir Robert Sparks, who heads the Anti-League of Rights campaign. We had an independent National Party man who said, well, he stood for the values that Joe Bajelki used to stand for. Then we had this remarkable chap called Perrott, an independent, and what did he stand for? Well, he only had one policy. His policy was the elector's veto. He said, I stand for the electors having a say. That's all I'm standing for. In fact, there's a story told that he took a small ad in the paper and took a small hall and said he'd show a video of Professor Walker outlining this idea, invited people to come along. He thought he might get 40 or 50. Nearly 500 tried to crowd into the hall. And then there was the Labor candidate. And when the votes went up, this fellow Perrott wins with a swing of 35% against the National Party candidate. Unprecedented Australian politics. And the alarm bells are now ringing all over Australia. It's amazing the number of instant converts. Even Premier Ahern thinks the idea might have some merit now. Over in Western Australia, the Liberal Party is discussing. That's why I say, if the League of Rights is behind all this, we're taking them all over. And they're all worried. Because you see, Mr. Chairman, at long last we've got a program. We have demonstrated by hard work you can get support for it. So what we've got to do between now and the end of this year is, first of all, we've got to defeat every proposal that Mr. Hawke puts up on changing the Constitution. There's 4 major proposals. The safest thing for us to do is say no to the lot. Absolutely no. We want nothing to do with it, in spite of the fact some of the weak, wishy-washy Liberals are going to have a couple of bob each way, but say no. But what we've got to do is to develop this grassroots movement using our constitutional right to petition the Governor-General and to petition him to say we want him, as he's constitutionally obliged to do, to direct his ministers to let we, the Australian people, have a vote on whether we would like that veto system, the Swiss system, introduced into the Australian Constitution. That's how we got the Constitution, from the grassroots. That's the way we've got to preserve it, and that's the way we've got to extend it. And I believe we can build a grassroots movement in this country. The politicians and all the would-be politicians and all the rest dare not defy. Because I believe now the Australian people are grasping that the nation's slipping away. It's being sacrificed, being sold out. All types of groups are coming together on different issues because they realise it doesn't matter whether you're concerned about taxes, it doesn't matter if you're concerned about Aboriginal land rights, and let me tell you that's an explosive issue. It doesn't matter if you're concerned about immigration. If you haven't got a mechanism for doing anything about it, all we do is demoralise ourselves by telling ourselves just how bad things are. We've got to move from that position onto the offensive, and we've got to put our backs behind this campaign so that it sweeps Australia. And I believe, Mr. Chairman, if we do that, history will recall that in the year 1988, the Bicentenary Year, this was the year when the Australian people got themselves together, went back and tapped in to their genuine heritage, back to their roots, back to their Christian values. This was the year in which they insisted that they were going to take control of their own country again through this constitutional reform. A history which would record the year in which the Australian people not only saved themselves with their own exertions, but I believe we could save the whole world by our example, because we are a nation that's got the resources. We've got everything going for us, my friends. We've got everything that we could possibly require. All we've got to do is to find the sort of spirit that we found in ourselves during the darkest days of the Second World War. If we can go back and rediscover that spirit of Anzac, spirit of Dakota Trail, that's the spirit, I believe, that can really save this country. And I believe in doing so, we not only are going to be faithful to those that gave you this tremendous heritage, and my friends, never forget, they gave it to you. Your forebears built this for you over 1,000 or more years. You inherited it. Your duty is to ensure that it's passed to your children, your grandchildren. And so therefore we've got this tremendous responsibility. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, there's been a very comprehensive exposition of the history of government, the misuse of power, and the manner in which we might do something about the misuse of power. Now, questions are now in order. I'd like you to address them, direct to Mr. Butler. Please, no speeches. Let's have clear-cut questions, and this will give us time for a good many of them. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. The first question.
Mr. Butler, would you please repeat the matter concerning what Mr. Dunstan deleted from the South Australian government structure? I wasn't paying attention. I was concentrating on some of the horror of the other things that had been said.
The question concerns what did Mr. Don Dunstan do. What I was referring to is the fact that the old traditional Labor Party, distinct from this new bunch that's hijacked the old party, even it in its program supported the Swiss electors' veto system. It was in their platform up until the year 1963. And at the annual conference that year, Mr. Don Dunstan was the man who moved that be deleted from the platform. No doubt of the opinion that perhaps one day some bright Labor member might look at that part of the platform and say, well, why don't we implement that? So Mr. Don Dunstan, a Fabian socialist from way back, was the man who moved for it to be deleted, and it was deleted from the Labor Party platform. I'm merely drawing attention to the fact it used to be in the platform.
Thank you, sir. That makes it clear.
Further questions?
Anybody else?
Well, perhaps I'll drop one in here while we're thinking up the questions. Mr. Butler, you intimated that the ID card did just temporarily still, and I think that there's any amount of us expect that this will be so, but has there been any further evidence come forth to support this?
Yes, there is. For example, we've got a piece of legislation before your federal parliament right at the moment. I haven't followed the last week, but I think it's still in committee, Senate committee, and it's called the Cash Report Bill, in essence, under which, if that legislation is introduced, all cash transactions in Australia, irrespective of the financial institution, not merely a bank, credit union, any financial institution at all, which is responsible for transferring a sum for a start of excess of $10,000. It's got to be properly recorded with obviously new government bureaucracy. So we're going to start right off by ensuring that everybody that's got any cash transactions over $10,000 is going to go into a central reporting system. Once you've established the legislation, then by regulation all you've got to do is keep dropping the $10,000 down. You could even get down to as low as $200, and every transaction in Australia then's got to be fed into the system, into the computers, and so you're well on the way to getting your ID card. I might also say that To keep up with what is taking place is now almost impossible. There are so many conventions being signed, and there's a convention that either has been signed or is about to be signed concerning an international tax arrangement under which we exchange taxing information with all members of the OEDC countries. In other words, your tax information may turn up on the desk of a bureaucrat in Brussels or even in the Soviet Union or somewhere else. All this is going forward all the time. A number of conventions, for example, I might just say in passing that we just remind ourselves of this, that you'll recall the famous Bill of Rights battle. Now, the Bill of Rights was introduced because Australia had signed an international convention, the convention known as the Political and Civil Rights Convention. Again, both sides, the opposition so-called and the Labor Party, both supported, endorsed it. And so the Bill of Rights was introduced to give effect to that convention. That was temporarily beaten, but may I warn you, it's still there, and the government is constitutionally obliged to give effect to it when they can possibly find it politically, shall we say, expedient to do so. No doubt most people have forgotten completely the other convention, which is like poison seeping through our society, the convention concerning non-discrimination against women. Now that's already wreaking havoc, because slowly but surely we're being told women are equal to men. No one's allowed to discriminate, right down to even in fire brigades, although they're striking a few problems, they do discover that there's certain biological differences and a woman can't carry as much as a man, so they're lowering the sort of regulations. It's all madness. Business is supposed to have an equal number, and this is poisoning our society. It's an extension of that aggressive feminism, which again has destabilised the traditional society. And all that's the result of a convention that most people have forgotten about. And you could go on and on. So these conventions simply provide the federal government with the constitutional power to slowly but surely tighten the net over every aspect of our affairs. Anybody else?
Mr. Butler, yesterday I heard Mr. Hawke talk about his efforts in attempting to help not only the unemployed but also the homeless. It appeared to me that Hawke was perhaps lying, or better still, he was talking to himself. He wasn't making contact with me. It seemed empty to me. It appears to me that in relation to that point, the Swiss are doing something about doing something for the less fortunate, or for just the people generally, and this is related to the veto point. Every Swiss has to do national service in the country, and up to the age of 32, I think it's 3 weeks a year, and then up to 50 or so, I think only 2 weeks or whatever. The point is, every Swiss serving person has a weapon at home. They can call them up within 24 hours. Within 24 hours, the Swiss nation can defend itself. This, it appears to me, is not happening in Australia, where the average person, certainly in the schooling system, I've noticed this, they don't know who they are. They identify with nothing really. They're not prepared to serve the country. Do you believe that it would be worthwhile to reintroduce a national service?
I couldn't agree with you more, sir, and thank you for raising that aspect of the Swiss society, which I pointed out in this great gun control battle, that you don't prevent crime by controlling guns. You don't make people better by passing more laws. The only way in which we get harmonious relations with individuals is by going back to basic principles. Now, in the case of Switzerland, as you've correctly pointed out, not only don't they not take guns away from people, everybody's obliged, every household in essence, really, to have a gun, and are part of the defence system, and it's not without interest that Switzerland has the lowest violent crime rate in any European country today. That is a matter of fact. I also subscribe to the idea that if we're going to develop some sort of a national purpose, then we've got to inculcate that into our young. That means we've got to change some of the educational practice we've got at the moment. Instead of knocking our heritage, we've got to take it out and get people proud of it again. And certainly a system of national service training, even if only elementary, would be the greatest advantage from so many points of view. And may I say, and I know some of you here tonight who are ex-servicemen would agree, we saw, particularly in the New Guinea campaign, we saw virtually kids with no training, little training, thrown in, suffered enormous casualties, whereas if they'd had proper training it might have been very different. In other words, if we're going to belong to a society, we have a responsibility to try and protect that society. And I believe this would be a most hearty, very, very heartening development. But you see, it's all been knocked out under the anti-patriotism and anti-nationalism. Skilled cadets are out. You see, it does something wrong to the kids, we're told. So I completely agree with you, and Switzerland is the model. Switzerland's a country which has not been attacked for a long time because it'd be a pretty tough nut to crack, geographical position apart from anything else. But the whole nation is geared to defending itself. I just shudder to think, Mr. Chairman, what would happen if we really did suffer in this country at the moment a major invasion. I do understand the Boy Scouts are still operating, and it's about the best we can say.
So just like to make a comment. The gentleman over there may or may not be aware there has been a civilian movement carried on in Australia after the First and Second World War. The Australian Rifle Clubs. They were controlled by the Defence Department on the 23rd of February, 23rd of March. I'm not sure, either February or March this year. The Australian Rifle Club regulations were repealed by the federal government, and sometime after the 30th of June, Australian Rifle Club members will have to comply with state firearm regulations.
Well, the gentleman has pointed out, which is true, to remind ourselves after both the First and Second World Wars, we did have part of our, you might say, our heritage in this country, a tradition, civilian rifle clubs, and they have continued on until now as part of this total program of centrally controlling it. The federal government has taken that right away, and of course those clubs are all now going to come under state laws. In fact, it's all part of the total program of destroying something which I believe is the most valuable aspect of our Australian way of life. Anybody else got a question? Any questions at all?
Getting back to honouring the Constitution, I read somewhere recently that the committee that the government appointed, the commission, to go into this Constitution to give advice to see where it could be resolved to, hasn't given its report yet, and yet I believe those bills are going to be presented this month. Is that right?
There's a bit of obscurity concerning where we've got to with the Constitutional Commission, which the government did appoint. A very interesting commission, stacked with Fabian socialists, secular humanists and one or two traditionalists. And really what they've been doing is spending our money, taxpayers' money, as part of a propaganda exercise. Even engaged an American firm, Walter J. Thompson. Apparently we couldn't produce anybody ourselves here. And they have turned out some most sophisticated material, and some of you may or may not have seen it, but I draw your attention to one video film they've made, which is very, very skillful, very low-key, all designed to convince you that what is wrong with just change, a little change, we're always changing. And so that's part of the propaganda exercise. Now, whether they've formally brought their report down or not, I'm a bit hazy about, but you can see that the federal government's real aim was to have these referendum irrespective of what they did, but that was all part of the propaganda exercise. However, the Constitutional Commission has had to admit that it's had more submissions on the Swiss system than any other issue. And I've got to just make a warning here that my great fear is under the tremendous pressure building up, we may get something offered to us which will be a garbled form, a perverted form. For example, the Democrats have got a proposal up, the Australian Democrats, which is extremely dangerous, in which they're suggesting that changes only take place with 2/3 of the Australian total electorate, which means that the Australian change would all be governed by Melbourne and Sydney. No one else would be able to really have an effective say. It's aspects like this that have got to be watched. I don't say cynical, but when you've been around as long as I have, I wouldn't be surprised that the major parties may even run phony independents in an attempt to siphon off what is now taking place, because there's no argument the upsurge. They can't stop that. They are worried. What we're going to do is keep our eye on the ball and ensure we don't get some phony proposition put to us which may look superficially good but which doesn't meet what we require. Fortunately, we've got access to some very fine constitutional experts in this country, and there's no argument the campaign that we are running and the petition that's going to be presented before long, which everybody can work to get signed, will be properly based and directed correctly so that there can be no escaping the end result. Anybody else?
Mr. Butler, I'd like to ask you a bit more information on this groundswell movement. If I had your knowledge and I could talk like you, well, there'd be no problem. But I'd like to see something, I don't know whether groundswell produces it or believe might produce it as maybe one simple radio case to handle this veto question that you could turn around and even if the stereotypical and the member of Parliament refused to reply to you, you always put that in question. Could you give us some information on that?
All right, the gentleman here asked and give some questions about the groundswell movement. Now again, without trying to pat the League of Rights on the back, there is no argument, and the latest outburst against the League proves that. There's no argument. It's the work the League has done. It's the pioneering work, the sowing. That's what's producing these movements, in some cases without being directly in contact with us at all. It's like a type of yeast that's working in our society. So, for example, when the parties up in Queensland tried to label Mr. Terrett there, the independent, some sort of a League stooge, he's not a member of the League of Rights, never has been, but obviously he's absorbed something that's been going around in the community which the League has promoted. And the more these ideas are taken up, the League's quite happy. Now, what you're asking is something simple, and I would recommend, if anybody wants something simple, Professor Walker's little book, a big book, has been reduced down this type of synopsis, which is available here tonight for $1, which anybody can read quickly, and it explains the whole idea. Then as far as the groundswell movement, and there's a number of these movements now, there's one in Queensland, they call themselves the Jack-Up movement, and all these other movements. Information can be provided, and perhaps we'll do that through the League journals more, to answer that particular question, but I can assure you the people in Adelaide were just ordinary Australians that concerned about their country. I think from what I hear, most of them would be Christians. No one of them's not, but he's very concerned. And they just got themselves together, formed a simple committee just to promote this idea, get hold of the candidates, and they went on from there. Now, no doubt other ideas can be developed as we go along, but I can assure you there's an enormous amount of work now being done on presenting or framing what's going to be called the Monster Petition, which will enable at least 1 million Australians to unite and say that's what we want the Governor-General to direct the government to do. Anybody else? Questions? Yes, sir.
Mr. Butler,
Do you know how many states of the US have a Swiss system in there?
The question's been asked how many states in the USA have this. There are at least 24 have variants of it. And some of you may recall a few years ago that in California there was the famous Proposition 13, I think it was, where the electors there insisted that their property rates, which is one of their most heavy taxes, that be drastically reduced because they knew there was a lot of government reserves and there was no need to cut government expenditure and services. They could drop the taxes. They eventually had it put on the ballot paper and then they voted, and they voted overwhelmingly for it, and they are obliged to drop that tax. So it's operating in 24. There's a number of the states in Italy are looking at it, and in fact up in Canada at the moment. In New Zealand now there's a big movement just started there because they've all got the same problem. They got it worse than we have because they've virtually got no constitution at all and no upper house. So the movement is starting to take off, and again the Swiss have operated it for 90 years. But may I say again, it is not new. It's the fundamental idea under which we once used to govern ourselves, when we did have a say. All we're asking is we get it back again. That's not going to solve all our problems, we know that. But we can't even start to solve anything till we've got a mechanism which to do it. There are other activities that can go along with this, including the break-up of the party system, and I think it's encouraging to see that good independent candidates now are starting to be regarded more favourably. You see, it's now, over 40 years since we elected an independent to the federal parliament, J.T. Lang in 1946. Before the Second World War, there was always a sprinkling of independents. In fact, you go back into British history to the time they had no political parties at all. They were all independents. And so therefore you had a genuine, free, deliberative assembly, very similar to what you've still got in areas of local government. And those of you in local government, and I was in it, you know, of course, that fortunately you've kept party politics out and you managed to operate within the framework of financial restraint imposed on you. You don't need parties to run local government. We don't need in fact, there's no reference to political parties in our Constitution at all. They don't exist, according to the Constitution. That's a thought-provoking fact, isn't it? So, yes, in the United States and elsewhere, this idea is growing. Further back.
You've heard of King Gifford? You've heard of King Gifford?
Yes, I have heard of him, yes.
How authentic is his advice to local government?
I think in the main, as far as I understand, very good. I rate him as one of the greatest authorities on local government in this country. And my long experience when I was in council, when we had association with him, I formed a very high opinion. I've studied much of his material. The last time I looked at his material was during the big battle we had here in Victoria about the attempt to amalgamate councils, and he gave very, very good advice then. Of course, I might just say on that, as you all now know, our Fabian friends are trying other techniques to get the same result by changing the grant system so that you're virtually going to force the councils to amalgamate themselves and say, well, there you are, they want to do it anyhow. Anybody else? Any other questions at all?
Yes, Mr. Butler, it's not related to the subject. I personally have a growing feeling that Joe was set up when he was run for Canberra. I'm just wondering what your opinion is of the fact that maybe the Honourable Sir Robert Sparks setting up with idea of giving with it.
Well, the question's put, do I think that Sir Joe Bajilki-Peters was sort of set up with the Joe for Canberra campaign by Sir Robert Sparks and the rug pulled from underneath him? I'd have to say that there is evidence to suggest that could be true, but it's certainly true that the Premier was very ill-advised by people. I might just say for the record, and this is generally well known, that I have enjoyed an association with the Premier for many years, and the advice that we gave him was not to get himself involved. We felt it was a trap. That doesn't mean I don't think he didn't make mistakes. I think he did. I think he misjudged a lot of the support that he thought was there, which wasn't there. Joe Bjelke-Petersen was one of those political phenomena that demonstrated that if you can in a society establish a symbol or what looks to be a symbol standing for certain values, that all those elements in that community that also support those will gravitate to him. So Joe was a symbol to many people. They saw him as a symbol of those values they stood for. That is why this disaffection in Queensland at the moment. They now see the Queensland government under Mike Ahern standing for values that they don't relate to anymore. And so that was the tragedy. I think that Sir Joe would have been better advised to have kept himself independent and retired with proper dignity as an elder statesman. I'm really sad that he wasn't in the place he should have been at the opening of Expo, because that's the way it should have been. It's very sad the way it's finished. And I'd have to say that Sir Robert Sparks is a man that's got to take a great deal of responsibility for what's happened in Queensland, what's happened in the National Party. The old National Party, I think, is finished. Sir Robert Sparks stands for a different set of values. He's a power man, secular humanist. And, of course, as we see at the moment, he's almost paranoid about the League of Rights and has been for a long time. And so he must accept much of the blame. But I see a cleansing process in Queensland politics. I think there's a new situation out of which something will emerge. And I think this man that stood in Kingaroy and got a swing of 35% against Sir Robert Sparks, I think that man's done more than anybody else to demonstrate the way things are running. I expect that development to be emulated and to grow. That is why I'm going to say tonight again, I anticipate the next 6 months in Australian politics are going to be quite different to anything we've had in the past. I see a completely new situation, new mood, the breakup of old party loyalties, fragmenting alliances. We are in a completely different situation, and a situation which we've got a tremendous opportunity to bring people together, Australians together, to strike a very constructive blow, because there's no argument that the spirit is still there. What it needs is some catalyst, something to bring it out, and I think we're on the eve of seeing that.
Has the Fabian system penetrated the Duntoon Academy and the Army?
Well, I can't speak with any great authority, but when you talk about the Fabians, people ask me, do I think, well, to be specific, someone asked me the other day, I think Malcolm Fraser was a member of the Fabian Society. Because he did say the other day, one of his more remarkable statements, he's always making those, that he says that Bob Hawke's government's the best Conservative government since his. Now that says something for you, don't you? What we're dealing with tonight are not so much labels, we're dealing with ideas. You might even give the analogy of a type of disease. Now some diseases affect all sorts of people, and some that don't even think they got the disease. And I would say large numbers of the Liberals have been badly contaminated without joining the Fabian Society, but they're contaminated with the disease. The secular humanist philosophy, which is virtually a new religion, is reaching right into every aspect of our society, including, I'm quite sure, amongst the army and elsewhere. Regretfully, of course, even into the pulpits. In fact, you've reached the stage where the pulpits themselves become, unfortunately, rather suspect because the disease has penetrated there. Now, that doesn't mean they're all members of the Fabian Society. What it means is they've been contaminated with ideas which are permeating our whole society. But fortunately, there is a reaction, and that is why I'm encouraged that large numbers of people now are starting to instinctively feel something's gone wrong. As far as education's concerned, I think there's a couple of generations have gone, but I do notice now that large numbers are beginning to face the fact that it's not only a question that Johnny can't read or write, but Johnny's manners and everything else seems to have gone to the dogs. Why has that happened? What's happened because of the breakdown. You know, there's an old saying that some of you will recall, that manners maketh the man. Manners have gone out the window. Again, come to Melbourne, get on the trains 4 o'clock every day and see all the kids coming home and see the behaviour. I don't care what schools they come from. My 2 sons went to what we rated one of our best public schools. I tell you, when I look at what's coming out of it now, I'm just horror-stricken. It's awful. No manners, and I regret to say the behaviour of the girls in any case is worse than that of the boys. There is a manifestation of the breakdown. It's everywhere. But nevertheless, there is this growing realisation something's gone wrong. We've got to go back to basics. And I believe, in essence, that paradoxical though it may seem, the very plight of the world is the hope of the world. You see, the plight of the world is the result of violating absolutes. Now, as long as we hold on to that and know those absolutes are there, when we humble ourselves enough and go back to the absolutes, there's a way out. If there were no absolutes, our position would be quite hopeless. The whole thing would be anarchy. So that's the encouraging sign. There are developments everywhere that I see it. You'd be surprised, reality. But I don't think we should fill our minds with so much of the evil that's going on. There's no room for any positive, constructive ideas to take root there. We've got to have a balance. Otherwise we simply destroy ourselves. You can become overwhelmed by evil. That's why I try and be as cheerful as I possibly can. I think all Christians should be cheerful anyhow, because really you're on the winning side. Anybody else?
This is a different subject, although I believe it's part of the overall world strategy. The Catholic Society, I've read several books on this, and it would appear that our Catholic Society is somewhat trailing in implementation. Is it just because there's other things that have taken the media and we haven't heard anything about it? Would you know anything about it, please?
Well, on the question of the cashless society, now first of all let us establish there's no argument there is the concept of establishing one. I have in my bag here tonight a copy of the report prepared for the Prime Minister by a committee set up and cost, no doubt, we taxpayers a lot of money to examine the whole question of the introduction of a cashless society. Now, they had to admit, if you go through it, it's a very big volume, it's extremely difficult. My own view is that it is impossible to implement what is called the cashless society. Even in the Soviet Union, where they have the most totalitarian form of government in the world, they have not been able to so suppress human initiative and resourcefulness that they still don't operate black markets, they don't operate a form of cash economies and much else. Even under war conditions, and those that serve will recall, even prisoners of war, it is amazing the resilience, the creativeness of the human being. And so the totalitarians have got a tremendously difficult task to implement what they talk about. It's for that reason they will never ever implement successfully what's called world government, because that's contrary to reality. What they will do in the attempt to produce, they will produce breakup. That's what we're threatened with. It's not as if you're likely to finish with a rigid world structure that works. In the attempt to impose it, you're going to break up society as we know it. It's that reason I don't get particularly het up about those stories concerning computers. Because, you know, the more we have computers, the more vulnerable computers are. If someone does throw the equivalent of a spanner in somewhere, you produce a tremendous mess, don't you? Our society, the more centralised it becomes, the more easy it becomes perhaps for someone to fragment it. So there's no argument the attempt is there. In essence, I think we've got a lot of madmen trying to achieve what is unachievable. And that's an idea as old as man. It goes back, right back to Alexander the Great or beyond, to those that believed if you have all power in one set of hands you can make the world run much better. There's people that believe we've got elitists that can do that. And there's a whole literature, the secret societies, back closer to our times, the Illuminati, the breakup of the family and much else. There's no argument the program is there, but to successfully implement is another thing. So I've got great faith in the resilience of the human being so long as we hold faith, or firm to our faith. And this is particularly at the moment, I think, a tremendous challenge to every person, and I'm not here to preach to you who calls himself a Christian. I don't care whether you go to church or not. But it's a tremendous challenge to those that have got an understanding of those values, because you've got at least an access to truth that others have not got. So therefore you've got a very special role to play in this. And so long as there's enough people like that, no complete totalitarian system can ever operate over an indefinite period. Even in the Soviet Union they're finding that. Solzhenitsyn's pointed that out to you. There'd be more real Christians, I think, in the Soviet Union than in the sick West. To be a Christian in the Soviet Union really requires real backbone. In the West, where you just got to perhaps go to church and have a cup of coffee on Sunday mornings, you know, the Sunday morning club, and, you know, social, that's all. But that's not the real thing. Sorry for that long answer to your question, but I think it's important.
I have to wrap it up fairly soon. There's one question here on my left.
Yes, I was going to ask, if the Governor-General got round to saying, forced into the position of saying yes, that Australian people have a vote on whether we implement the Swiss system or not, and people say yes, it seems to me that the biggest problems then would be the implementation of the detail.
Well, once it has been decided, then constitutionally, government is obliged to do exactly that. Now, if we reach that stage, and I take the point that some make, some attempt to sabotage, then we've moved to a very serious situation, which in essence suggests that those who have control of governments at the moment, of instrumentalities, are going to be in absolute contempt of the people. At that stage you've reached the end of the road, and the only question then to be decided is whether the ultimate in sanctions, which is force, and those still fortunately under the control, at least constitutionally, of the Crown, whether those forces in a showdown would be on the side of the Crown and the people against the government. That is why there have been skillful attempts to bring the control of the armed forces under the control of the Prime Minister of the day, or the government, away from the Crown. There's been a long campaign. But I don't think we'll reach that stage. But if you did reach that stage, my friends, I've got to be very frank, if you reach the stage where governments refuse to even operate in accordance with the Constitution, well, if you've still got a gun, that's the moment you better go and get it, because it can only then be resolved by going to the barricades. That's the ultimate in human affairs. But our forebears went there a long time ago, hopefully to ensure we don't have to go there again.
Well, one more question, right?
This revolt of the unions in Poland could ricochet into our satellite countries?
The gentleman asked, do I think the revolt of the unions and the Polish unions could spread into the other countries? That is right. Of course, the first major revolt, you'll recall back some years ago, was triggered off when those that controlled the international debt merchants, who controlled Poland's debt, insisted that the Polish government stop subsidising food, which kept food at a low price for the workers. Food prices escalated, and that produced the Solidarity movement. Well, this is triggering off again, because food prices again have escalated, and it is quite conceivable. What they're trying to do again there is, in the long run, not sustainable. And the totalitarian system possesses the seeds of its own destruction in the long run. It's a question of faith amongst a sufficient number of people to hang on until the situation reaches the stage where constructive action can be taken. And there's no argument, the polls, with, I'd have to say, the church there playing a very important role, has sustained the faith of a large percentage of the Polish people through a very difficult period. That's why in the Soviet at the moment we're faced with a change of tactics by Mr. Gorbachev, presenting himself as a more moderate and reasonable man, and even prepared to talk about some form of religious freedom, believing they can ensure that doesn't start to affect the situation. And the same as in China at the present time. If you don't know this, that you can now take Bibles into China. In other words, they are finding it very difficult to keep that spirit down, and so they believe perhaps let it come out and we'll more effectively control it in that way. So they're on the horns of a dilemma. And we come back to what I said before, if we take the long view, and we do believe in absolutes, and there is an absolute called truth, well, in the last analysis, truth will be the great disciplinarian. And that's what we've got to keep sustaining ourselves with all the time. And all the time be grateful. And while we've got to be upset about certain developments, but particularly during this year, let us be grateful that we in this country have got a tremendous lot going for us. We've got things going for us that other people haven't got. And talk about it. And I always come back to Australia every year from overseas, and this is really, in so many ways, the lucky country. Other countries have got problems that we have not got. They've got virtues. The American situation is much worse than ours because of that cosmopolitan type of society. The Canadians are much further down the road, although of course they've got our tradition, and I see developments in Canada that are going to start to turn the whole thing around. But here in this country we could be self-sufficient, our vast resources, our homogeneous population hasn't been fragmented as badly as other countries, and there's an enormous amount of health, and I think that's what we've got to work on. So we lift national morale up. We've got to sustain morale. Otherwise we'll feed one another with pessimism. And that's very negative. And, you know, the famous statement by the South African lyric poet Roy Campbell that you can become that which you fight. Evil is a very destructive force, and you can be involved so much in fighting it sometimes that you can start to be affected by it. That is why I think that particularly Christians have got to go to the other side and look on the positive, and don't get your mind so full of negativeness there's nothing there for the constructive. So I just simply myself refuse to go around wearing sackcloth and looking glum. I think we ought to be as happy as we possibly can. In fact, I'm one of those who believe, and I think poor old Senator Boswell didn't like that the other day, you know, a little sense of humour. They don't like that at all. That's the most destructive weapon of all.
Ladies and gentlemen, that closes the question session. I think Mr. Butler would like to say a word or two about the books and the periodicals.
All right.